Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Landscape Photography Show. We've got a wonderful show for you tonight. We have our returning guest that we love, Mr. Dan Hughes, and we're excited to have him. He's going to be talking to us about exposure, and every time Dan comes on, we learn some great tips. So hopefully everyone can learn from him, and we'll have another great show from him. So my name's Kevin Rowe. I live in South Jordan, Utah. That's northern Utah. And I love landscape photography. That's what I love to do. I'm a curator for the landscape photography theme and for the landscape photography community. And Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Kevin. My name's Tom Hurl, and I live in Carmel, California. I'm an amateur photographer. I'm a curator on the landscape photography theme, and I like to photograph along our coastline and also the Sierra. So. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Margaret.
Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Tompkins from the Kansas City, Missouri area. I'm retired and an amateur photographer. I like to get outdoors and take photographs of pretty landscapes that I find. And I'm also a curator with the landscape photography theme and the landscape photography community. So, on to Jim.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Worthman, based in Phoenix, Arizona. An amateur photographer, and I love landscape photography, especially in the desert Southwest. Like to do both color and black and white work, and I also curate for the landscape photography theme and work in the community as well.
Great, and we've got a guest panelist with us tonight, Kevin O'Connell. Just we got to get a couple more Kevins in here. That's better that way. So, Kevin, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin O'Connell from Chicago. I've been shooting landscapes with film, large format, digital. I love it all. A lot of fine art stuff, and I like to kind of travel to remote places if I can and get some unique shots. And I'm also a curator now for the landscape photography theme as well, and love it here.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go straight into our show starters. So these were photos that everyone submitted for the show, and we've each selected one that really stood out to us. And let me get my screen shared here. And Jim, this was yours, I believe.
Yeah, there it is. This is from Eric Castellan, and I really loved the vibrant colors in this, and the contrasting, warm tones in the sky and the cool in the water. Long exposure. I liked how it just softened the water up, and I liked the strong foreground with the rocks that just kind of anchor the photo and then draw your eye into the image. So great composition, great light, great exposure.
Great, thanks, Jim. And Margaret.
This is one from Mike Hankey, and there's just so many things I love about this photograph. I love the wonderful colors and patterns and textures in those rocks in the foreground, and wonderful leading lines with that bridge and going up, and then there's just this explosion in the sky. Wonderful colors and textures there, and such a sense of movement in the sky, and that kind of contrast to the stillness in the foreground. So just a super wonderful photograph for me. Really enjoyed this one.
Great, thank you, Margaret. Tom.
Hi, I picked this one by Mike Taylor. If you read the description, this is a fair amount of work. It's 16 exposures that he's put together, and it covers, I guess, 240 degrees of view, which is pretty good to get the whole Milky Way here. I love how he's got the exposure just right for the foreground, and has so much of the sky. So there's a lot of work that went into this, and also I learned a new word. The noctambulism is another word for sleepwalking. So thank you, Mike, for submitting this one.
And Mike's he's kind of a master of getting these blended images and night skies, so awesome. And then Kevin, this was your choice.
Yeah, my pick was Keith Cutterback, and he's out of San Francisco. And Keith seems to do a lot of HDR type images, but he doesn't overdo them. I mean, I really love HDR if it's done well, and he does some real quality work with HDR. And if you just look at the high dynamic range and the lighting, he doesn't oversaturate because he doesn't have to. It just kind of has a Rembrandt look to it, and I just like the feel of his work. So that's my pick.
Great, thank you.
Kevin, I'm going to jump in. Can you send another invite to Dan Hughes? He got booted.
I can. So this is my choice here, and this is John Hunt, and I really just a real even, nice photo with the reflection in the water, and then the tree line there on a looks like a little island is really nice. So let me try and get Dan back on here.
He's there.
There he is. You're back, Dan. Okay, and then Dan, we'll go right to your pick. This was the one you chose.
Oh, yep, and it's not showing up now. There we are. Yeah, so I just, Nirish had a really cool composition here. It was well balanced. I was quite interested in the tones. It was nicely processed. And it had this sort of quiet feel to it that I really enjoyed.
Great, thanks, Dan. Okay, I'll take my screen share off, and we'll actually head over to Jim. And Jim, if you'll just introduce Dan to us, that'd be great.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Hughes tonight. Our regular viewers will remember Dan from his days with Google Nick, where he created great webinars and videos. And we've had him on the show several times to discuss a variety of topics. If you haven't seen those back episodes, by all means go take a look. And after tonight's show and you see, you know, how Dan presents, I think you'll agree and you'll want to go view those past episodes. So recently, Dan moved on and he took a new position with Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT, and it's one of the premier photography schools in the U.S. So with that, we'll let Dan continue.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, so I was invited to teach at RIT, and actually let me check my audio to make sure that we're coming through the right portion. Yeah, it looks good. You guys can hear me okay, right?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, I'll get that lower thirds on in a minute too, but basically I'm teaching a Photo 1 class as well as a digital media class, which is creation of content. So doing these sorts of events, doing webinars, creating tutorial videos, creating sort of marketing pieces and stuff like that, and I'm teaching 3rd and 4th year students all that sort of content. It's a whole lot of fun. Teaching in this way is completely different than how I was teaching when I was at Nick Software. So it's a whole bag of new challenges, and it's just been, you know, very time-consuming, but really, really fun at the same time.
Awesome. So go ahead and start off, Dan.
Sure. So
All yours.
what I wanted to get into today was talking about exposure and really kind of getting off of program or really understanding kind of how aperture, shutter speed, ISO works so that you can control everything and all of the aspects of your photography when you're out in the field shooting. So I'll go ahead and switch over to a screen share, and if there's any questions or comments or anything, guys, feel free to stop me and we can sort of rotate through. I got to make sure I've got the right screen.
All the questions right now are just saying congrats and good to have you here again. So not really questions, just comments.
Oh, that's awesome. Good, good. It is, you know, it's really exciting to be back here. This was the first Hangout on Air that I had done. You know, your community here was the first Hangout on Air that I had done, other than specific ones for Nick Software. So it's cool to be invited back. It really is nice. Now, getting into our kind of components of exposure, and this is very, you know, kind of simple. Lots of folks understand this part of it, but we're going to sort of demystify a lot of the things that maybe are issues that folks run into. And, you know, your first sort of pillars, if you will, of exposure are your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. And here we've got this really nice graphic that kind of shows you the relationships we're going to be tackling all of these relationships and how they work in the next 25 minutes or so. So your aperture, which is the opening of the lens itself, the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor that's inside of your camera, and then your shutter speed, which is basically how fast or how much time the sensor sees light, basically. Now, we've got these kind of abstract concepts here: ISO, aperture, shutter speed. How it kind of relates to what we're doing in the field would be your program mode, your let's see here. Geez, that's a few more clicks than I expected. Your shutter priority, right? So these are your different modes in your camera. Your aperture priority, and I'll go back and sort of cover each one, and your manual mode, right? And what my goal is, after we get through all of this sort of talk about exposure, is, especially for landscape work, getting you into using that manual setting on your camera. Now, just to jump back, just too far, trying to go way too fast here. Your program mode, right? So program isn't professional. It basically just means that the camera is going to do the best job it possibly can to give you an exposure. The problem that you run into with program is that you're not controlling anything, right? You're just saying, camera, do your best. And then depending upon how the camera wants to meter, right, depending upon the settings that you've got, you're going to get something. But it isn't your something necessarily. It's kind of what the engineers who develop that camera decide the exposure should be. Then you've got another tool called shutter priority. And your shutter priority basically allows you as a photographer to utilize shutter speed, and then the camera chooses the best aperture. And we'll get into exactly what shutter speed and aperture is in a minute or two. But basically, you get to choose the amount of time that the sensor sees that light. Here we've got aperture priority, and it allows you, and this is something that's commonly used for different kinds of landscape photography as well, because some kinds of landscape, the shutter speed isn't the most important aspect, whereas the aperture, which is going to delineate your depth of field, among other things, is sort of the important aspect. But the beauty, or the best control that you can use typically, especially for landscape photography, is the manual setting. Because this is where you get to control your creative license over shutter speed, even ISO, and aperture. Now, to get into exposure itself, we've got this awesome bucket analogy, which I didn't realize was so widely used, but is apparently a pretty common way of putting exposure. And that is, to make up an exposure, you need an opening, right, the aperture. You need a shutter speed, and then your ISO, which is the sensitivity of your sensor. So you can think of it this way. Your shutter is like the spigot, right? So it's how long or how short the shutter is going to be open for. So that's how much time the sensor will see the light. The aperture is basically the width of the spigot itself. So it's how wide, how much water can come out at any one time. And then your ISO is basically the depth of the bucket, right? So we need to fill up the bucket to a certain amount to get our exposure. So we need these different aspects, and we can control these different aspects. And the thing is, and the one thing I don't really like about the bucket analogy, is it kind of says that all exposures are the same. When in reality, a good exposure is a good exposure, but depending upon your aperture, depending upon your shutter speed, you're going to get completely different effects. If you're shooting a waterfall, you might want a longer exposure so that you can get more movement, more motion integrated into that waterfall. So,
hey, Dan.
Yep, go ahead.
I think maybe right here is a good time to answer this question, and I'm hoping you have a good answer for this. I think it's a good question. Why? And it's not just on he's asking about a Canon 6D, but I know other cameras have it as well. Why does my Canon 6D have an ISO of 50 that I can turn on in settings? If lower is better, why isn't it on by default?
And we'll actually get into ISOs and sort of the not rule of thumb, but some suggestions for ISOs. Whether you're a Canon shooter or a Nikon shooter, those are the two that I've got sort of buckled down a little bit more. But yeah, some cameras can go really low in ISO, which is great because it allows you to control certain things, like your shutter speed. You can have a longer shutter speed at ISO 50 compared to a 160. But the digital sensors that we have they have an inherent ISO, basically. And with that inherent ISO, which is what the sensor is designed around, you get better dynamic range, you get better color renditions, and so there are suggestions for different cameras to have particular ISO setting. So, and that's why 160, for example, is generally the Canon ISO. But if you go down to 50, it will work fine, and you'll actually get a good noise to signal ratio, but you won't necessarily get the same color rendition. That's a great question, and we'll actually expand a little bit more on that once we get to ISO.
Great, thanks, Dan.
No problem. Let's switch over back into that screen share. Getting into Aperture just a bit. So, here's the definition of Aperture. Basically, it's the adjustable size of the opening in the lens that allows light to pass through. Each of these different things on screen here are different aperture settings, and they are delineated through stops. So in the upper left-hand corner, you've got 1.4, which is wide open. Right? That's a really fast lens, and it's a really fast aperture. But as you go to f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, basically what we're doing is we're making the opening smaller, which means we have to change the shutter speed to get what's called an equivalent exposure. But basically, the aperture is the adjustment, or is the physical hole that the light goes through before it hits the sensor. And you can change that. And what the aperture will control, actually these are just brief notes about what Aperture does, or different settings in the camera rather. But what Aperture will control is something called depth of field, which is the span of sharpness. Stuff that's in focus is the area that is called depth of field, basically. And we'll get into that in just a moment as well. But the thing that you want to think about, too, on our cameras when we're shooting in manual mode, you've got your little thumb clicker, right? And that's going to change your aperture. And depending upon the way you set up your camera, it might be different. But you've got, basically a forefinger and a thumb sort of adjustment on your different cameras. And each click is, by default anyways, generally a 1/3 stop increment. So I guess what I'm saying is, as you change that, as you sort of twist the little thumb wheel on your Canons, or the thumb one that's a little bit closer to the top on a Nikon and whatever cameras you might happen to have, typically each click is 1/3 stop. Just keep that in mind. Now, a stop is your unit of measurement, and that's how we can sort of figure out our different exposures. We delineate our light through stops. And here's a little chart about what a stop is. So you can see again those numbers with the aperture, 1.4, 2, 2.8, those are standard apertures. And then your shutter speeds. So starting at 1 second, 2 seconds, 1/4 of a second. One thing you notice about shutter speeds is that they're basically halving. Right, so 1 second, and then half of that is a 1/2 a second, and then half of that is a 1/4 of a second. So that's a one-stop change. Similar with ISO as well. So 12,800 is a particular ISO, and then you go down to 6,400, down to 3,200, and those are single stops. And this will make more sense as we move through and talk more about ISO and shutter speed, if you're not familiar with this term already. But just to touch more about aperture, kind of jumping back. Your aperture controls the depth of field as well, which is, again, your range of acceptable sharpness. So if I'm shooting at f4, which if we remember is a relatively big hole, what we get is a short depth of field. And you can see the image on the left there where the flower is in focus but the background is totally blurred. Right? So that's great for portrait work. It's great for some kinds of landscape. It's great for situations where we need to shoot at a relatively short shutter speed, because the bigger the hole, the faster the shutter speed that we can work at. And then you've got f36 on the right-hand side, and you can see the image is much more busy, if you will. There's more stuff in the background that's acceptably in focus. And the flower is in focus as well. But this is your depth of field, right? At f1.4, we have an even shorter depth of field. If we were to go to something like f64, which isn't overly common in our digital SLR cameras, then we're going to have an even wider depth of field. We'll have more stuff that's in focus. Now, another thing that the aperture will change and control is something called diffraction. And don't necessarily worry about the terms themselves. Just if you can, and maybe this is a term you've already heard, but it's not necessarily important to know the definitions of these things. It's just important to know what's going to happen when you change your different f-stops, your aperture, right? So here's that same photo, but a close-up. We're all the way in at 100% zoom, and we're at f4. So you've got that very short depth of field. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and hit escape here so that I can use my cursor. Let's go ahead and zoom this out just a touch. So f4, it's the same photo as this one on the left-hand side. And what you'll notice is it has that very short depth of field. There's nothing in focus in the background. In fact, the front of the flower there isn't even in focus. But you can see just this one little strip that's in focus, right? So this is at f4. Now, I guess what I'm getting at with diffraction is that there is a ideal aperture for your camera that is going to be sharper than any of the other apertures. And typically the rule of that is just 2 stops up from the most wide open. So if you're shooting a lens that is, an f4 lens, the 2 stops up would be, you go from f4 to 5.6 and then 5.6 to f8, and that's typically going to be the sharpest f-stop for your lens. Now, your depth of field will still be very short at f4, and at f36 your depth of field will be very wide. But what I'm getting at is that there is sort of an ideal sharpness for these different kinds of lenses because of diffraction, right? And if we look at sort of the comparison between the previous image and this image, this line, which should be what's in focus right here, and you can see it right there. It's a little bit sharper right in this area. If we go to f8, it's actually much sharper. It's much cleaner. Now, as we move to f36, almost nothing is really tack sharp. You'll notice the stuff in the background is more in focus than it was before, right? You can actually discern what these things are a little bit, but you'll notice that at f36, this stuff isn't sharp at all, where it should be, but the focus didn't change at all. And that's because of diffraction, right? So what's happening is light is spreading in a different way because of the size of the aperture, and with this particular lens, f8 is going to be the sharpest. In fact, f8 and f11 are usually pretty good for most lenses in terms of sharpness based upon diffraction. In fact, just another sort of, if we jump back, this is a large screen version. Here's f8, and here's f36. So you can see it's pretty dramatically different, zoomed into 100%. So what I'm getting at with landscape stuff, sometimes you need to be shooting at f22, but if there's a situation where you can get away with shooting at f8, and you get the depth of field, stuff that you want in focus at f8, it might be better to shoot at f8 because you're going to have a sharper image overall. Now, just a little on photo terminology, so that if you're out in the field and you're talking to someone, you can say you opened up a stop or closed down a stop. What that basically just means is that you're opening the aperture or you're closing, you're shutting down the aperture to get less light to come through. Now, speed of lenses. Right, I think there's 3. Yeah, there's 3 here. So the speed of a lens pertains to the most wide open aperture you can get. So with a lot of fast DSLR 50mm lenses, 1.4 would be considered fast. Whereas if you go to a super wide lens, let's say, or even just a 24 millimeter wide lens, 24 at 1.4 is an unbelievably fast lens. And that's why you'll also pay $2,000 for a lens that would be, an f1.4, because it's just unbelievably fast. Among other things, they're going to be very, very sharp as well if you're paying $2,000 for a lens. But the speed has a lot to do with the costs of those lenses. Generally a slower lens, maybe an f2 50 millimeter lens, if that even exists, would be $150 as opposed to $900 with a 50 millimeter 1.4. But it's not just pertaining to speed, too. Now, just getting into talking about sort of the effects of aperture. So here's a very short depth of field, right? When Reno shot this, they're shooting this at a very, very short depth of field, so you get that really sort of nice blurred background. Here's Chris's shot where the foreground's out of focus and the background's out of focus, right? If I were shooting on program, I would just hope that the camera would do this. If I'm shooting on aperture priority, or if I'm shooting on manual, I'm able to basically control these aspects so that I can get that super short depth of field. Or for a landscape image, if I wanted a much wider depth of field, here you can see those flowers in the foreground. They're not necessarily tack sharp, but they're pretty darn sharp. They're acceptably sharp, especially considering that mountain in the background is really, really sharp. And just a few more examples, talking about depth of field and controlling the aperture. So here's a very short depth of field as opposed to an Annie photograph, which is relatively wide, and also, pretty much everything is in focus. Now, getting into shutter speed. And aperture is going to come back around at the end. We're going to sort of loop this rodeo back into the sort of exposure once we get back over into aperture just a touch. But shutter speed, right? This is going to determine the amount of time that the light hits the sensor, and this might also be obvious, but this is really super important with shooting in a landscape situation. Slower shutter speeds, they're going to give you more exposure, right? Because it's a longer exposure, so more light is hitting the sensor, but it also gives you more motion. And that's why, for anybody who maybe does long exposure, photography or night photography, you're familiar with lots of movement and motion because you're likely doing 30-second or 60-second or several minute exposures for getting sort of the motion of the stars if you're shooting star trails, or for getting the motion of water, right, using maybe neutral density filters. So that slower shutter speed is going to give you more motion, whereas a faster shutter speed is going to allow you to freeze the motion. And getting into your shutter speeds, just a touch, right? Here's a nice little graphic that starts to explain, from left to right, your speeds and what they can kind of do for you. As you get into your, notice the bottom one, which is kind of interesting. So the faster shutters are going to give you less noise. Now, we don't really have to worry about that too much because even a consumer level point-and-shoot camera can do pretty darn well at a 2-second exposure. Although don't try to hand-hold a 2-second exposure. You definitely want to be using a tripod for something like that. In fact, a kind of rule of thumb for shutter speed, and this is what I recommend at first, and then you can kind of graduate up. You want to be shooting, and I'm not sure if I put this in the presentation as far as a visual goes, but you want to make sure that your shutter speed is double the millimeter of your lens. So if you're shooting with a 50 millimeter lens, you want to make sure that your shutter speed is at least a 1/100th of a second while you're hand holding. As you get more experienced and maybe a little bit more steady, you can start to shoot at a 50th of a second, or I should say a 60th of a second, since that's a real shutter speed, with a 50 millimeter lens. Because that breaks down into magnification of the lens and then what's called camera shake. I will still kind of stick with that 2x rule because for some reason, I don't know if my heart beats really hard or something like that, but I can't get around camera shake at a slow shutter speed. Some folks can hold a 15th of a second. I can't handhold a 15th of a second. I can barely handhold a 60th of a second successfully with a D800 anyways.
It's all that caffeine.
Yeah, it could be a little high strung.
And Dan, if you're using a lens that has a stabilization on it, usually your lens is kind of rated for how many stops it's good for. So using that same chart, it's pretty easy to see what benefits you could have and how much lower of a handheld image you can take.
That's a great comment. I didn't even get into image stabilization or vibration reduction or whatever the camera manufacturer calls it that you're shooting with. That's a great point. Yeah, because you can definitely handhold at much slower speeds when you're using those image stabilizers. I kind of forget that those exist sometimes when I'm not shooting. You know, when I'm shooting, they're on, and I'm not. You know, they're just there.
Right.
Yeah. And here's some examples of a fast shutter speed compared to a slow shutter speed. So 1/20th of a second compared to 4 seconds. So what's going to happen with that same exact situation? And then some more examples. So here's a long exposure shot of a landscape with that water moving. Here's a long exposure shot of a portrait, which is really quite interesting. I assume there's flash used, and then also some sort of other lighting, whether it be daylight or something like that, with the motion. And then here's a situation where you want relatively short exposures even though you're shooting at night, right? So for anyone who shoots starscapes, or whether it be Milky Way shots or photographs of star trails, you actually attack those exposures in a very different way. Your Milky Way shots are generally going to be a much higher ISO and a much shorter shutter speed than your star trails, where you're actually trying to capture the movement and the motion. And when you get into figuring out how these relationships work, the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture, you'll be able to just walk into any situation and get pretty much exactly what you want out of that situation, as opposed to kind of allowing the camera to just do whatever it thinks is the right thing to do. A couple more examples of shutter speed. So this is an example of what's called panning, where the object is moving very, very fast, the subject rather, and the camera and the cameraman is actually, or camera person rather, is panning, is moving at the same speed and rate as whatever the subject is, at a relatively slow shutter speed. So let's say in this case a 30th or 15th of a second, so that they are sharp but the background's out of focus, which is pretty much a stark contrast to this example, which is a very fast shutter speed. Where you're not getting the movement of the bike forward, you're not seeing really the wheel spinning at all in that back wheel, but you're seeing that dirt come up and it's frozen in its motion. Definitely interesting. Same sort of thing here. So 3 different examples. The subject is spinning at the same rate for all 3 exposures. It's just we're changing the shutter speed. So you're seeing no motion on the left and then tons of motion on the right. And that's basically the effect of your shutter speed. And that comes into a huge play when shooting landscape. Really anything, but very important with landscape, considering motion. Now, ISO. Your ISO is the sensitivity of the camera sensor, or film if you happen to be shooting film, and it of course delineates how much exposure is needed to create a good exposure. Now with that, your lower ISOs, which are going to generally yield you higher quality images, need more exposure. It's not as sensitive, as opposed to a higher ISO, which is going to be much more sensitive, and you get more noise typically, which is the grainy bits that you'll see in imagery, especially as you move way up high in ISOs. Although, like I said before, cameras are getting so darn good that you can jump up in ISOs really high and not have any problem. You can be hand-holding at 6400 ISO on most current cameras and get absolutely amazing photography out of that. Whereas 5 years ago, if you moved up to 6400, you were lucky if you got a decent exposure that had a decent dynamic range to go along with it. Now this kind of gets back into one of the questions that we had earlier. So your camera actually has an inherent ISO, which is the ideal ISO for that particular sensor. Most Canon cameras, inherent ISO is 160, and Nikon it will depend upon which body you're using, but it's either 100 or 200. If you go into, let's say, L1 or L.7, those are low settings on Nikon anyways, in terms of what they're called, and they will give you a lower sensitivity, which is very nice because you can have, let's say, a longer exposure, or you can use that for flash purposes and so on. But you don't get the same quality as what you get with the inherent ISO of the camera. Now, just a quick graphic about ISO. And this was taken from Digital Camera Workshops. This is that's a fantastic website as well. They've got great tutorials, and they've got fantastic graphics that are like this, that just spell out things in this very simple, pithy, concise way. But at a low ISO, you get a good signal-to-noise ratio. That's what it's called. So what you'll see on the image on the right, on the top there of the woman, it's very clear, it's very sharp, and there's no noise, compared to in a low light situation, where the bottom situation, there's not a lot of light, so you have to boost the ISO so that you get more signal, but you also get more noise. And that's what's going to happen when you jump up in your ISOs. So back to kind of coming around to what we've talked about: aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and we didn't spend too much time on this sort of pyramid here, but this is a really important figure, because as you develop these relationships and understand exactly what's happening within the camera, you decide whether you need a fast or slow shutter speed for more or less blur based upon motion, and then your low aperture, high aperture, so larger f-stops, smaller f-stops, and all of these things come together, right? Because you're always dealing with some sort of shutter speed, some sort of aperture, and some sort of ISO. And typically you can set the ISO and just kind of leave it for whatever situation you're shooting, typically anyways. Whereas your aperture and shutter speed, you're going to be changing depending upon the goal, right? And those goals are delineated by whether you want to capture that motion or capture that depth of field. So the other thing that we've got to sort of cover is something called equivalent exposure, right? So here's a base exposure, and that base exposure is 1/60th of a second at f8 at 100 ISO. Right, and this might be what the camera says is the correct exposure if we were to, use the program mode. But maybe we want to shoot with a little bit less depth of field. We want the exact same exposure because we need the brightness of the image to be the same, because that was perfect, but we want a shorter depth of field. Well, what we can do is use what's called an equivalent exposure, where we would change the ISO maybe, or the aperture or the shutter speed. Basically, what I'm saying is you can change these different settings and you can get the exact same equivalent exposure, so the same brightness. So working into something like this. So here, the 1/60th of a second at f8 is the exact same exposure as 1/4000th of a second at 1/4 at 400 ISO. Now, here's a little bit more of an example of that, and it's just a really nice kind of visualization. In the upper left-hand corner, you've got that ultra-short depth of field, fast shutter speed, whereas in the lower right-hand corner, you've got a slow shutter speed, relatively, a 1/15th of a second at f22, and look at the difference, especially if this is a windy day. If that was a more windy day, you'd actually get more movement and more motion from the leaves there in the foreground. It would be maybe not necessarily as sharp. You'd get that motion, but you'd have a wider depth of field, which might be important. The other thing that we can look at, and which is kind of interesting here, is it's called bouquet, which we didn't talk about at all. But if we were to zoom in somehow, let me see if I can do this. Jumping into... and I haven't learned my shortcuts within Keynote here, but bouquet is the sort of tendency of the particular lens that you're using in the out of focus areas. So you see this area back here, sort of a little circle. You can see as we go into from f3.5 to f5.6, we're getting a little bit more of a shape, right? And this is a, you can see 5 edges. And then as you move over into f10, you're getting even more of a sharper edge bouquet in that background. Until you get to f22, which in this case, we almost have discernible detail back there. You can kind of see that this is a fence post, and I have no idea what's back there, but you're starting to be able to see that information and that detail. But those are your equivalent exposures, right? You're getting the exact same brightness, but you're getting different effects because of the shutter speed and aperture. And that's really what's kind of important to think about. And looping it back into more landscape photography, and I don't know why I'm so bent on night photography today, but here's 3 different examples, right, where you've got sort of the hand of man on the left-hand side, where you've got to balance the natural exposure, what's happening in the sky, and then also the exposure that's happening in the walkway. Right, so we've got to sort of work with that at a certain aperture, a certain shutter speed to balance everything. Notice all of the motion in the trees as well. So that's just the movement of the palm trees, as compared to your star trails in the upper right, or your Milky Way shot in the lower right. Right, so a very different set of effects, and it's based upon those exposures. And any of these things, I mean, the one on the left there would be hard to do star trails in because of the fact that you have to balance for the man-made light. But you could likely shoot, depending upon the situation, because I'm not sure exactly where the upper right-hand corner image was shot, but you could likely shoot a very similar photograph of the Milky Way in the upper right-hand shot, even though it's a star trails image. And it just pertains to the choices you make with your exposure, as opposed to letting your exposure, or your camera rather, choose whatever it might want to do. But that's about it for, I guess, the slideshow portion of the demonstration.
Great. A couple questions. So, one is how is ISO critical in landscape digital photography in respect to outputs? Is ISO 100 still better than, say, ISO 400?
Well, it's going to depend upon your camera. ISO 400 is pretty darn good on almost any camera nowadays. But where it's more critical isn't necessarily, choosing the ISO based upon the quality of the ISO. It's choosing ISO based upon what it will do to affect your aperture and your shutter speed. So, for example, if we go back to that slideshow, if I were to test an exposure at night, like the exposure, sorry, I've got to go back into screen share. If I were to test this exposure here, well, let's say any exposure, like at nighttime in the upper right-hand corner image, oftentimes at night especially, I'm going to raise my ISO up really, really high, right, to 12,800 or higher, to do a basic exposure just to make sure my image is sharp, and just to make sure that I focused properly, and to make sure that my composition is good. Then once I've done my test exposure, what I'm going to do is then choose the ISO and my aperture and my shutter speed to be dependent upon my goal. Right? So let's say I wanted to shoot this situation at f5.6, because that's going to give me the depth of field that I need to make sure this is in focus, that's in focus, and then my background's in focus. Well, then I do want to make sure that I'm on like a 30-second exposure, because to do this sort of photography, in most cases, you're doing a series of 30-second exposures, and then stacking them together in a piece of software, so that you get the circular movement, that motion, throughout the entire sky, as opposed to just 30 seconds of that. So you choose that shutter speed at 30 seconds. You've already chose your f-stop at 5.6. Well, now I'm forced into choosing an ISO that is maybe 600 or 640 or 800. That way I can get the exact shutter speed and the exact aperture that I want, so that I can create this sort of stacked photograph for the star trails. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, great. Definitely. Yeah, and with landscape photography, you know, usually in daytime shots, you're trying to keep that ISO low, and what can really help that is just using a tripod. That way you can make sure you can keep your ISOs fairly low, but definitely nothing wrong with 400 on any of today's cameras at all. So here's another one in relation to the ISO. I have never heard that before about inherent ISO for a camera sensor. Is that to suggest that if I'm on a tripod with good conditions, I should actually shoot at ISO 160 to match my camera's best quality rather than ISO 100?
Yeah, and you know, you get you can change your ISO and you're going to get great results now. But the inherent ISO basically means you're going to get the widest dynamic range, which is the most amount of information that you can capture, you know, from shadow to highlight. And then you're also going to get the best color representation. Because, you know, when these are developed, when the sensor is developed by these groups of engineers in the company, whatever, Canon, Nikon, Sony, whoever develops the sensor, there is that inherent ISO, which means that is the ISO that particular chip is sensitized for. So that amount of electricity that's running through the sensor is going to give you that ideal situation. In fact, if you ever look at specs, you know, for dynamic range or for color rendering, it's at the inherent ISO for that sensor. You know, but like Kevin said as well, you know, you typically want to keep a low ISO, right? You know, the inherent ISO is going to be best for color rendering and for dynamic range. But at this point, with these cameras, you can go, you know, up to 6400 ISO and get pretty darn good quality, and you can go down to 50 ISO or, you know, low 1 for Nikon cameras, and you're going to get amazing dynamic range and color as well. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, and really why not shoot at the 160? But you know, where you're getting into that is if you want to go to 50 because you want a little longer exposure without using a neutral density filter to blur some water or something, you're going to have a hard time seeing the difference between a ISO 160 shot and a 50. You're going to have some pretty good eyes. So my advice is kind of don't worry about it from 50 to 800. You're good. You know?
Yeah. Yep.
You agree with that?
I would, yeah.
Great. Okay, great. Well, we appreciate it, Dan. That was good information. Oh, we lost Jim for a minute here. Let's see if he's coming back. But I'd just like to reiterate that we've got several shows with Dan on, and you can go and you can look at those through our landscape photography show page and then go to the YouTube tab, or you can just go straight to YouTube and search for landscape photography show, and there's lots of shows in there, and he's got great information, so go ahead and go check those out if you'd like some more information on it. And we got you back, Jim, so I'm going to head over to you to do our recommended photographers. I think we got you back.
Looks like it froze.
Yeah, I think that's frozen.
Okay.
Tell you what, we've got a minute waiting for Jim. Those of you from the landscape photography community, you're invited to go over and check out the event that's going on now. We're featuring one in honor of Scott Kelby's Worldwide Photo Walk. So the restrictions this time is that it has to be a current photograph. So go out your front door, take a photograph of what you see, or wander around your neighborhood perhaps, and doesn't have to be a super famous spot, just pick your neighborhood and shoot us a photograph and share it with the landscape photography community. So that event is going on now. Would love to see everyone post a photograph there.
Great, thanks, Margaret. And I'd like to put out we like to have Dan every once in a while, and I'm sure we'll have him back again. I'd love for our listeners to post some things that you'd like Dan to come back and talk to us about, because Dan's a pretty smart guy about this photography stuff, right? So, and he's a great teacher. That's what he does. So, I'd love to hear some information. It looks like Jim's still frozen. So, what we're going to do is, I apologize, but we're just going to go ahead and skip our recommended photographers for this time, and we'll just carry those over to our next show in 2 weeks. And we'd welcome everyone to, like I said, come in and log into the show and post in there what you'd like to hear from Dan for the next show, and then we can start working with him and figure out a time. I'm assuming you wouldn't mind coming back, Dan?
No, that'd be great. I'd love to.
Yeah, when we enjoy having you. So we appreciate it, and we'll go ahead and end the show. And good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks again.